Hey everybody, it's Useless Bytes. I'm just here to talk today about a really fun Crystron deck profile. Now, Crystrons aren't the most meta of archetypes, but they're a lot of fun and they're one of my favorites. They focus on synchro summoning during your opponent's turn, and then using the effects of those synchro monsters to disrupt your opponent's plays and mess with them, and then leave a board wide open for you to swing. Alright, getting right into it, we'll start with the non-Crystron monsters. Start with 3 copies of Gen X Undyne. So Gen X Undyne, when it's normal summoned, allows us to pitch a water monster from the deck to our graveyard and add one Gen X controller to our hand. Gen X controller is a nice little machine tuner level 3, so it can be useful, but most of the time it's just search fodder so we can dump a water monster into the graveyard so we can get our plays going. Next up is 2 of those said Gen X controllers. Not much to say. He's just a target. They're just a target for Gen X Undyne. You typically can run 1, but I really don't like Undyne to be dead in the hand if I draw into a Gen X controller, so I like to run 2 just in case. Our last non-Crystron main deck monster is 3 copies of Scrap Recycler. Scrap Recycler is very similar. If you normal summon it, you can send one or special summon it, you can send 1 machine-type monster from your deck to the graveyard. And all of our monsters are machines, so that works out really nicely for us. Well, actually, Gen X Undyne is Aqua, but we would never be pitching a Gen X Undyne. The important ones are machines. So next up, we have our big combo starter, our big combo piece. 3 copies of Crystron Sulfafnir. So for Crystron Sulfafnir, you can, if it's in your hand or your graveyard, you can discard a Crystron card except for itself, special summon it in defense position, and then pop 1 card you control, which is already not a bad effect. But counting the fact that it can pop itself, it becomes a really good combo starter because when it hits the graveyard or is destroyed by a card effect or by battle, you can special summon 1 Crystron monster from your deck. So typically you'll be wanting to use his effect to discard a card, summon him out, pop himself, and insert something else out of your deck. Most people would run him at 2 because he is a little bricky if you draw into multiples, but I like it at 3 for the consistency. Next up are our tuner monsters. We start off with 3 Crystron Citri. So Crystron Citri is a level 2 tuner, and during your opponent's main phase or battle phase, you can summon a monster from the graveyard and immediately synchro summon with it. But it has to be a machine type synchro, and you can only use those 2 cards. And Citri and the other material get banished then. But hey, we've got plenty of machine-type synchros to be the target of this. It's a great way to interrupt your opponent's turn with stuff like Crystronometrics and other combos we can go into later. Next up, we run one of the other Crystron tuners, 3 of Crystron Rion. Similar effect to Citri, except he fetches monsters from the banished zone to synchro summon with, and after they're used, they are shuffled back into the deck. So really, you could run 3 or less than 2, or less than 3, probably 2, because he does recycle himself back into the deck to be searched out again. But I like 3. Next up, we get done with our tuners. We have our main deck Crystrons. We have 3 of Crystron Theistvern. So Theistvern can target 1 card you control and pop it. Special summon a Crystron tuner from the deck. And then you can only synchro summon machine-type synchro or you can only summon machine-type synchro monsters from the extra deck for the rest of the turn. So it's a good tool to get out any of your tuners. And also, when he's in the graveyard, you can banish him from the graveyard to search for any Crystron monster. So, obviously pretty good. The searches are good. You want to run 3. Actually, and all the other Crystron main deck monsters share the tuner summoning effect and some variant of banishing themselves from the graveyard. So, next up, we've got 3 Crystron Smyger. Good level 3. That's probably the reason we run 3 of them. So, aside from his popping to summon a tuner effect, you can banish him from the graveyard to search 1 spell or one Crystron spell or trap from your graveyard or from your deck. Now, there's only 2 Crystron spells or traps, but they're both traps, but they're very, very strong. in both graveyard effects and actual effects. Next up is 2 Crystron Praesiordal. Only 2 of him because he's not as good, but he is just his name is Crystron, so he works well. Level 2, so it's a little awkward if you want to use Citri to tune with him. You can only really go into Quandax. But anyways, so his special graveyard ability, aside from the pop to summon tuner, is you can banish him and special summon 1 Crystron monster from your hand, which can come in clutch normally sometimes, but typically you really don't have problems getting things onto the board and material on the board, so it's not the most useful effect. And then next up is Crystron Rosenix. We run 2 copies of Rosenix. So Rosenix's ability is it can banish itself from the graveyard to summon one Crystron token, which is a machine water level 1 0 attack and defense token. Again, we only run 2 of these because the level is not ideal, but it's useful and the tokens are useful. So next up we get into spells and traps. We've got just staples when it comes to spells. We've got 1 Cosmic Cyclone. We've got a Called by the Grave to deal with those pesky ashes. We've got Raigeki, although I have been experimenting with Foolish Berry, or with Dark Hole, because a lot of your Crystrons, when it comes to the Synchro monsters, have floating effects when they're destroyed by card effect or battle. So it's an equally good option. I usually side deck it. Next I have Foolish Burial, just getting combo pieces in the graveyard, mostly Sylfafnir. That's all for spells, not a very spell heavy deck. So next we're moving on to spells and traps. So starting up, we have the first of the Crystron spells, Crystron Entry. We're running 3 copies of Crystron Entry. So Crystron Entry summons a tuner from your hand and from a Crystron tuner from your hand and from your graveyard. Good. Honestly, the effect's a little niche. I don't use it a lot, but it's more important is the graveyard effect. So if it's in the graveyard, you can banish it and send a Crystron monster to the graveyard from your deck, and then change the level of 1 Crystron monster on the field to the level of the monster sent from the deck. So that's really useful because it sets up graveyard plays early on, and it also just allows you to go in all sorts of different synchros. Next up is the infinitely better Crystron spell and trap. We have Crystron Impact. We're running 3 of this. So Crystron Impact, it fetches your banished monsters. And there's going to be a lot of those, so it's really good to get recycled monsters. And then you can banish it from your graveyard to negate effects that target your Crystron monsters. So good recycling, great protection. It's a great card. Next up, we've got typical 2 Solemn Strike. And since we are so light on spells, I run an anti-spell Fragrance, just in case. I have another one of those sided if need be, usually, but usually just 1 is fine. So that's the main deck. That's all there is to the main deck. Pretty simple. Now we're moving on to the extra deck. So starting off the extra deck, we have 1 Mistar Boy, which is... he's kind of just here as a panic button. He clears out the extra monster zone if we need him to, but that's really the primary utility. So next up we have Link Spider. We can use either Gen X controller or the Rosenix Crystron tokens to go into this, but mostly he's just a tool to get to Needlefiber. So coming up, here's Crystron Needlefiber, the star of the show, absolutely legendary. This is a proxy because Konami hates us all. Please import him. Anyways, so Crystron Needlefiber, amazing card, super easy to summon, super generic. Summons tuners, banishes itself to summon synchro tuners. It's just a great card all around, and is going to be an essential combo piece. So getting on to the synchros, which is what the rest of the extra deck is, we have 2 Crystron Emetrics. Level 5 Crystron monster. When it's synchro summoned, you can turn all your opponent's special summoned monsters to defense position. And if this card is destroyed by a battle or card effect, you can target a Crystron monster in your graveyard except a synchro monster and special summon it. Really good card. Alright. Great for the interesting plays. You can get it out super quickly on your opponent's turn with a Crystron Citri, and turn all their special summoned monsters to defense position. It's a great interrupter. Next up is Crystron Quandax, the staple Crystron Synchro Tuner. So he's got the usual effects. You can synchro summon one monster you control. But if the synchro monster is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can target one Crystron monster in your graveyard except the synchro monster, summon it. Same old, same old. Pretty useful. Level 4 is also nice for going to other ones. So here's one of the two Crystron big boys. We have Crystron Phoenix. So when Crystron Phoenix hits the field, he requires one tuner synchro monster and one or more non-tuner synchro monsters. So typically the best way to go into him is with Crystron Clon and Crystron Metrics. So when Crystron Phoenix hits the field, you banish all spell and trap cards your opponent controls and in their graveyard. So like, screw Sky Strikers, am I right? No, but in general, it's a great option for removal when it comes to spell and trap cards. It doesn't target, so it's a great card all around. I don't go into it a ton. Because I feel like there's better options in the deck. But it is always useful because the deck does lack in removal when it comes to back row. Next up is two of the other Crystron big boy, Crystron Quarion Gandrak. So Quarion Gandrak requires two or more tuners and then one non-tuner monster, and he's level 9. So typically you'll be using 3 or 4 monsters to bring him out. Typically either a Rion and a Citri or any combination of those two, or maybe your Quan or another tuner. Or your Quandax. Anyways, so when he's synchro summoned, you can target monsters your opponent controls and in their graveyard up to the amount of synchro materials used to summon him, and then banish that many monsters. And then banish those monsters. Yeah, so it targets, but it's good non-destruction removal. It's kind of what you're going to be looking to go into a lot. There's a couple ways to get into it during your opponent's turn, and it can just be a devastating play interrupter, as well as clearing out the graveyard. So moving on to the non-Crystron monsters, we've got Shooting Riser Dragon. So Shooting Riser Dragon pitches a monster to the graveyard when it's synchro summoned to lower its level by that amount, and and obviously it's a synchro tuner. So target for Needlefiber, great card overall. Next up is F.A. Dawn Dragster. This is a little bit of protection the deck has. It's an option. You can lower its level to negate stuff, but it's also useful for a little trick you can do with Citri that I'll explain in a bit. Next up is Black Rose Dragon, or Panic Button, because hey, sometimes you just gotta nuke the board. Rounding us off are Trishula, for the usual reasons, and then Crystal Wing, because who doesn't love this bad boy? That's the whole deck for me, but there's just so much you can do with this deck. It's possible to get synchros out so fast. It's honestly insane. I'll show you a couple things you can do that I like to do. So you can get out Needlefiber, turn 1, off of 1 card. If you play your hand, if you know what you're doing, if you open a Gen X controller. So, what you can do is, say you start with the hand and you have in your hand Gen X controller. It doesn't really matter what else you have in your hand. You can normal summon Gen X controller, throw Crystron Rosenix into the graveyard, and then add Gen X controller to your hand. So, and then you banish Rosenix to summon a token. Use the token to go into Link Spider, and then use Link Spider's effect to normal summon, or to special summon Gen X Controller from your hand. And since Gen X Controller is a tuner, you can now go into Crystron Needlefiber, who can then summon a tuner. So you've got all sorts of options there to go out from there, because you still have your level 3 Undying on the field, so you could go immediately into like a Metrics. Another cool thing is if you say you end with the tuner and Crystron Needlefiber, you can, and say you have, let's get a level 3, say you have a Crystron Smiger in the graveyard. You can activate Citri's effect during your opponent's main or battle phase to to get Crystron Smiter on the field, or another level 3 or any level monster really, to use its effect, and it would normally immediately synchro summon, but since Needlefiber's banishment effect is a quick play, you can banish it to summon a Crystron tuner. Let's say we summon Crystron Quandax. And now, Crystron Quandax is in the extra monster zone, and these two have no way to get a monster out because the extra zone is occupied, so you just keep the effects. And then, what do you know? We've got two tuners, level 6 and level 3. And he can tune through quick effect. And there you go. On your opponent's turn, you've got Crystron Quarion Gandrax. Anyways, Crystrons are just so much fun, and I love them so much. They're a great archetype. Really wish we can get Needlefiber sometime soon, but that's all for now. If you liked the video, please subscribe. Hopefully I'll have more of these up soon, and thanks for watching.